Good morning. Today we are going to be reading from Titus chapter 2, and I'm going to read verse 11. I think I have spoken on this verse in a devotional maybe this year, I'm not sure. But this is a very powerful verse that really impacts a person's life. It talks about the power of grace and what grace teaches us. Now, when we think of teaching, we shouldn't think of instructing as in the law, wherein a person is taught by the law as pertaining to commandments, wherein it is just the commandment on what you need to do. We should think of a person that's maybe been in a motor car accident and now is going for rehabilitation, and somebody is teaching him how to walk or how to use his hands again. It's somebody that's really putting in effort and taking the responsibility upon him to bring forth a new life in the other person. So when the Bible talks about grace teaching us, it's more than just an instruction as pertaining to the law. It is a force that works in us that brings forth the life of God in us. It says here in verse 11, it says, For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. Now it explains the salvation. It says, it teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age. So we see here that the grace of God teaches us how to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions. Now, we find that the Apostle Paul, even after his conversion, when he became legalistic in his own mindset, that he said that he struggled to say no, because the law cannot teach you how to say no to worldly lusts. If you look at the commandments of the law and you think that through obeying the commandments of the law from your own willpower that you're going to make it, I've got news for you, and this is what the Apostle Paul said from the beginning. The law doesn't have the power to teach us to say no to worldly lusts. It doesn't have the power to help us to live self-controlled lives and a godly life in an ungodly world. A world where there's no uprightness. So if you live in a world where there's no uprightness, if you live in a world where things are ungodly, how are you going to get it right to live a godly life? Only by the grace of God. Paul defines grace as the power of the resurrection, the power by which God brings forth a new life in us. That is what grace teaches us. Now, in this short devotional, I cannot go into exactly what grace is, but I can simply say this. Grace is the power that raised Christ from the dead, the power of God to keep His promise. God has promised us holiness, God has promised us His life, and grace is the power by which God brings forth His promise. And as we are not trying to bring forth the promise of God by our own lives, but trust Him, we find that His power works in us. And it teaches us to say no to ungodliness. Now, let's take this a little bit further. If we think of the world, if we think of politics, if we think of what's going on in the world, what would the only solution be to get governments in line? For instance, there's only one answer, and that is the grace of God. These leaders, these people, need the gospel of God's grace. They need to hear the message of God's grace. They need to believe the message of God's grace so that God, by His grace, can teach them and bring forth in them a godly life that is self-control, that is upright, and that shine as light in darkness. That is the only way. So I want to say to you, church, that the message of God's grace is not only the only hope for us, whereby we can share in the life of God, where we are not under the control of what is evil and bad. It is the only way by which the world system can ever come right. There's no other way. It says here in Romans 6:14, and I read, "For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace." So the only way by which the world can ever come right is if they believe the gospel of grace and stand under the message of grace, and God, by His power, brings forth a brand new life. So I want to encourage you today to know that as you spend some time to hear about God's grace, as you hear about His love, as you hear about His goodness, as you hear about His kindness and His endurance, as you hear about His work to bring forth life in you by Him fulfilling His promise, you will find that that message of God's love teaches you, not like the law, but from the inner being, from the power of the resurrection in bringing forth a new man. It teaches you a new life. It can give you power that is greater than what you could ever have imagined you could attain unto by making another decision to try and serve the Lord. It's got much more to do with you humbling yourself and allowing God to serve you with His life. And when I say that, I'm thinking of Abraham. Abraham was a man that could not bear children, and God came unto him and made a promise unto him. And what did Abraham do? He believed God. He didn't consider the weakness of his flesh, but he believed God. And the grace of God taught Abraham and Sarah, we can put it this way, the grace of God taught Sarah's womb how to be fruitful, how to multiply, how to receive a child. Now, Abraham, in his own ability, Sarah, in her own ability, could never teach herself in her old age how to have a child. But the grace of God taught Abraham and taught Sarah how to have children. That is what I'm trying to communicate to you today. And I read Titus chapter 2, verse 11 in closing again. It says, "For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people." That doesn't mean all people will be saved. It simply means that grace is now available for Jew and Gentile. That's what it means. Verse 12, "It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age." The best life to live is a life where you are not controlled by the passions of the flesh, but where you are controlled by the love that God has for you. And the grace of God teaches that. How does the grace of God teach it? In the very same way that it taught Abraham and Sarah how to have a child. It was not by something they could understand, neither by something they could do. It was by simply believing that God can keep His promise. And the grace of God, which is God's power by which He keeps His promise and bring it forth, brought forth in Sarah and Abraham Isaac. Glory to God. Thank you that I could minister to you today and serve you with this good news that the grace of God gives you God's quality of life. God bless.